Great. So I work at Bruce Design. We have worked with companies like Skullcandy. Our background is actually we started working with artists. So I agree with everything that was presented before, except for the Eve Klein blue stuff. I think that's beautiful, and I'll show you a lot of blue stuff today. So I am going to take you through kind of some high-level thoughts about what we do when we do essentially web design and design for web. So this is kind of the ideal process. So I'm going to be talking to you a little about what we do before we start designing, what we do during designing, and what we do after. So this is kind of the ideal process. This is often the reality of how things go, which is kind of okay. They kind of go all over the place. There's an iterative process. But we like to work somewhere that's a bit like this, so we're kind of always going in the same direction. But a little chaos is good, especially for people like us who have a bit more of an art background. Did anyone else here go to art school by any chance? Awesome. Okay, so apologies for my drawings. I studied advertising, not drawing. So I'll start with before. So the first thing we tell all of our clients before we start working is know thyself. So I think that talk we just heard was great because a lot of what we try and do is help people understand why they're doing what they're doing. So we work not only to help them create kind of a brand identity, but also a visual identity. But what we often find is when people come to us with web design projects, they think that we kind of help solve brand problems through web design. But typically what we need to do is actually figure out what all the brand problems are before we can do the actual web design. So all those questions about kind of the why, how, and what, that's kind of essential before the kind of actually rolling it out across different applications. So know thyself. The next thing we always work with our clients to do is state your goals or goal. So these can be a huge range of goals, but it's always great to kind of have them down in writing. So they can be very clear, very explicit. So sometimes we work with clients who just want to entertain people. Sometimes it's about education. Sometimes it's about raising more money. So being very kind of clear and overt about what those goals are kind of essential to kind of to creating great design. Because if we don't know what those goals are, it's hard to actually achieve them. So it might seem somewhat rudimentary at times, but just having kind of a clear list of here are our top 3 goals are kind of great to actually reaching them. The next one is understand your audience. And I think this is something, there's a whole bunch of tools about how we can understand our audience. What we often do is spend a whole bunch of time interviewing our clients and the users. So we recently finished a project in the US as part of a Head Start program where a lot of social workers had to deal with students and kind of keep track of them. So we spent days kind of following them around, understanding what their process was, how they engaged with websites, how they engaged with digital kind of tools to help kind of take down their paperwork time from what essentially was 80% of their time down to about 10% of their time, so they could actually spend more time working with the kids. So there's a whole bunch of different ways of how to understand your audience, but until you know who your audience is, it's really hard to kind of connect with them. And another big one that we always try and do before we start projects is to acknowledge constraints. So I think there's no one who has no constraints when they start a project like this. So the constraints can be anything from budget to people to I guess even just kind of creating content. So we always make sure that along with a list of what the goals are, we also know what all the things that potentially are stopping us in our design. And as a designer, we kind of love constraints. Without constraints, we have to start to work in kind of the realm of art, and that can be a bit scary sometimes. So knowing what these constraints are really important for us to kind of know what we're working within. So moving on to during. So this is kind of the meat of the process. So once you kind of know who you are, who your audience is, what your goals are, you can kind of start getting into the actual design. So one thing that we always try and do is create multiple great solutions. So has anyone here ever done kind of a scenario exercise where you kind of test out a bunch of different options? So for us, it's really important because it means that not all the pressure is put onto one single project. So we can test out, we can kind of go to extremes in a lot of different ways because we have multiple solutions kind of on the go. And another reason we do multiple solutions is because it means we're more likely to hit on the right solution. So even though our first iteration might not be right, because we've found a way to kind of test out a whole bunch of different ways to solve a problem, we can kind of cherry pick from them and figure out what is the one single solution to kind of move forward. And this is something that I guess all designers try and do is be different in a way. So I mean, there's billions and billions of websites. So as a brand, you need to find some way to kind of stand out from all that. So there's a whole bunch of ways that we can be different, whether it's through the content, through the design, but we always try and make sure that it is something that's different. One recent example that we kind of got the opportunity to work with was the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington. So it's part of the Smithsonian. It's their modern art collection. There's no Yves Klein Blue, unfortunately, there, but they have lots of other great pieces. But they have this really interesting building that's essentially designed as a donut. So you kind of walk around in these circular structures. So one thing we try to do with the website is to kind of emulate what that experience is like. So you can essentially start scrolling left or right, and it just takes you in a total loop. So there are ways that we can find, through simple things like how the website is organized, to kind of be different and kind of hold up true to what the brand is about. And the flip side of that is to be the same. So there are always, I guess there are conventions in digital through user experience, through what kind of people are expecting. And there are lots of places where it's really important to be the same and essentially to create what they're expecting. So whether it's through using Google Maps, for example, as just something that people are used to, through certain icon designs, there are certain conventions that just make everyone's life easier if you kind of follow them. And the thing that's really exciting for me as a designer is when you kind of follow certain constraints, it allows you to push the differences further. So all great design is kind of has these contrasts, these things that rub up against each other. So finding places where we can be kind of the same as everyone else allows us to be even different in the other areas. And levels of detail. So our studio's background, we do a lot of stuff with book design and also signage and wayfinding. And through those two, we learned some tools that we've kind of since applied to web design. And one of those is levels of detail. And this is around the idea that people read your content at a whole bunch of different speeds. So for signage, as an example, we're dealing with people who are driving by. We're dealing with people who are walking, who are kind of lost and walking slowly for things. So even in books, you have people who kind of flip through content, who are meticulous and kind of read through everything. So it's the same for web design. People have all these different ways that they kind of engage with content. So what we try to make sure we do is find ways that we can essentially help people with all these different levels or speeds of reading, I guess I should say. So creating a clear hierarchy, so whether it's kind of an image-driven site, big headlines, there are different ways that you can kind of adapt to different speeds of reading. So that's always one thing we try and do in terms of just the design of sites, is make sure that at a glance you understand what it's about. There's ways to read more, and if you really want to kind of get in depth, you allow that as well. And I guess this is going back to my art or design background as well. But we feel really strongly that style itself is substance. So I know there's a lot of content is kind of king, and style should kind of support it. But in a lot of ways, style in itself is substance. So if you look at something like typography, for example, that's essentially the tone of voice in which you speak. So it's your graphic tone of voice. So a lot of conversations, for example, it's not so much what people say, but how they say it. So your typography is really how that gets across. And with web design, it's really interesting for us because the style and the substance are essentially two different pieces. So you can style things in a whole bunch of different ways, and it's separated from the content. So one thing that we try and do in terms of making sure that our style is telling the right story is if you take the logo away from the site, can you still tell that it's of that certain brand? And also sometimes we just put placeholder copy in. And if you can still kind of, without any content cues, can you still understand what the brand is all about? And this one is a kind of a detail-oriented thing, and it's about this idea that everything communicates. So everything from the overarching concept of how the site is designed to the smallest little details. There's so many great places where you can kind of find little details of how to kind of bring the brand to life. Has anyone seen the website Little Big Details? I suggest you guys kind of all check it out, but it's kind of a ongoing collection of little small kind of user experience or UI details on websites that are just really beautiful. So there are everything from during the World Cup, the little Google Maps guide turned into a soccer player. So there's just little cute things like that. Vimeo, for example, if you search for fart and scroll down, it makes a fart sound. So there's all kinds of weird little kind of playful things you can do. So finding those kind of minute details to kind of express your brand are something that's always kind of fun to do. And as your users kind of find them, it's pretty exciting. So moving on to after. So after you've had kind of a party, your website is launched, life is good, the kind of next big phase of work starts. So after is always really important. It's really important to listen. So I know we've probably heard a lot about kind of analytics, and there's kind of, that's one way to listen, but also anecdotal evidence is really important. So kind of hearing how people refer to your website, how they talk about it, how your clients kind of, what are kind of pain points for them, what is working. So this is a good chance to kind of go back to what those stated goals were, make sure you're hitting on them, make sure you've kind of accomplished what you've set out to do. And also listening is really important just for learning. So it's a great time to kind of reflect on what you've done and kind of hear how the project went. And the last one is plan for change. So something that our studio had kind of an interesting transition with is because our history was very much in books, we would print a book and it would be done. That was it. You just kind of you can walk away. But with websites, there's so much more of an iterative process, and as soon as you're done, essentially the web design starts again. So what we have been working more and more to do is that essentially create a phased approach so that as soon as you launch the website, you're already starting to plan how you're going to change it. And this is really fun too because it essentially allows for opportunities to test new ideas. So we're always kind of testing how new ideas can work and kind of adapting them and kind of finding ways to spread them out through the rest of the site. So that's kind of, I guess, maybe a bit more artistic approach to how we go at website design. And hopefully some of those kind of high-level tips are things that you guys can use as well to help tell your story visually. Thanks.